Okay, welcome everybody. You are in the session of To Whom Does the I in FAIR Belong? Obviously interoperability. This is intended as a cross-group discussion between the FAIR Data Maturity Model, well, it's initiated by the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group and the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group. But of course, it's a discussion for all of us here in the room, for our panelists, and for all of us, all the people here online. So my name is Keith Russell. I'm Director Outreach at the Australian Research Data Commons, but I'm here because I am co-chair of the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group. I have two fellow co-chairs, Shelley Stahl and Edith Herzog, and Edith's with us online. Shelley sadly had to be in another session, so she couldn't make it. And from the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group, we have CJ here helping out. And we've got Andrew online, Mikiko, who will also be on the panel. So I think there's a good representation from all around. So the purpose for today, just a quick agenda. We'll start with a welcome and icebreakers. That was actually that Menti I've just put up a second ago, and I'll put up again. We'll do a brief introduction to provide some context. I'll talk about what the FAIR Data Maturity Model is in the working group. CJ will talk about what the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group does. Then we'll dive into interoperability. What does that mean? I'll provide a perspective from the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group. Andrew, who's online, will talk about the interoperability as identified by the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group, and then we will have a panel discussion. So I think we've got a full and a lively program, and looking forward to it. So first of all, icebreaker. If you have not already signed in, please sign in and point your phone at the QR code or go to menti.com 8224-5785. The first question, which I've got up, is a little bit of a question around, I'm just curious, where do you work? As in, what part of the organization do you work? What sort of role do you fulfill? And I'm looking at it now, it's rising, it's going up. So we have, big winner at present is research infrastructure with 5 people. But then we've got people working in research, in data management, and in funder policies. So, oh yes, yeah, data management and support is catching up a bit, but the general winner today is research infrastructure, with 7 of our participants being from research infrastructure. So the next question, see if this works. Have you now got a next question? Okay, that's the joys of Mentimeter. Now I've made it difficult for myself. Ah, there we go, found it. It's come up now, hopefully. Great, excellent. So the question is, where are you from? So oh yes, here we go. North America, oh yeah, North America's currently in the lead with 6. Europe's catching up, 5. No, North America's surged ahead, 7. Europe's catching up with 8. We have 2 people from Central America. Oh, Europe's now in the lead. Yes, I think Europe's come on top in the end with 11. 8 from North America, 2 from Central America, 1 from Africa, and 3 from Oceania. So it's a nice mix from all around the globe. That's nice to see. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. That gives gives us a bit of a perspective of who's in the room and what your interests are. So I'll give you a brief introduction to the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group, and then I'll hand over to CJ. So the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group. What happened is the FAIR data principles were originally written up and agreed, started off in the Lawrence workshop, published in the Nature article. And as they became popular and as a lot of people started to look at these, you noticed that there was a bit of ambiguity, or people found it sometimes difficult to interpret them, and it resulted in a wide range of interpretations. So that resulted in a number of different FAIR assessment frameworks with different metrics and was quite hard to compare those results. So the idea was, well, let's bring together all those stakeholders that have been working on this to see if we could come up with a core set of assessment criteria for fairness. And that would then result in a fair data maturity model. We clearly did not mean to create yet a new set of principles or a different set of principles. We also did not intend to create yet another evaluation method, but much more bring together what already existed. And started back in 2019, and here you see a bit of a timeline of what that resulted in. And the big output was the fair data maturity model, which is available online and has actually been picked up by quite a few organizations and tested out and used. It's basically a spreadsheet, an Excel sheet in which you can indicate your maturity against a number of questions. Those questions are very closely aligned to the fair data principles, and you get a wonderful little view of what those responses look like and where you have gaps in your maturity. So that's the link, and that gives you a bit of an idea of the fair data maturity model. Since that day, we've been looking at what have adoptions of the fair data maturity model look like, what have people learned in the way of lessons learned, and I'll speak a bit more about that when we come to interoperability. Okay, now I would like to hand over to CJ, who will speak about the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group.
Great, thank you, Keith. And so for those of you that don't know me, my name is CJ Woodford. I am a co-chair of the GWORK Interest Group and the International Model Working Group, which is officially over. And we're starting up a new working group, so that's going to be next plenary. We'll talk more about that. I'm a project manager for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, but I'm here with my GWORK hat on. So the idea of the Global Open Research Commons, or GWORK, is that we'd like to have a connection between research infrastructures and commons globally, such that researchers have seamless access to the research outputs and services and tools they need to conduct research. This is obviously a very pie in the sky goal, and we've got a lot of co-chairs working on it. Unfortunately, Andrew's picture is completely taken off the screen due to the Zoom, but that's okay because he's actually been shown on Zoom. Our co-chairs include Andrew Trillar from the ARDC, Latero Matas from La Referencia, Mikiko Tanafuji from NII in Japan, and Javier Albacete from the European Commission, and who's stationed in Belgium. So we're really fortunate to have 4 of our co-chairs here today, which is excellent. So I've already kind of said what the Global Open Research Commons is supposed to be. Seamless access to research objects and the services and tools that help research happen. The GWORK Interest Group was founded to determine the roadmap towards that pie in the sky goal. How do you actually get to commons that already have their own issues of siloed data, siloed researchers and disciplines working together to then have interoperation globally? The International Model Working Group was created to determine those first steps of, well, not just how do you do it, but what do you need to consider first? And also, what is a commons? So the interest group and the working group work together to create a set of typology and definitions in this space, and then the model itself provides a set of considerations on what a commons might need to consider to become part of a GWORK in the long term. The model feeds into the roadmap in the way that tells you what might you consider. The roadmap is a work in progress and is intended to be about implementation and how do you actually do it to get to this large global open research commons idea. There we go. So one of the main outputs is this definitions and typology. This identified what a commons is, the definition, as well as essential elements of a commons. The idea being that every commons should have something in each essential element, covering governance structures, rules of participation and access, human capacity, engagement, and sustainability on the human or social side, interoperability and standards that connect them together, with the technical aspects in blue on the bottom, which is ICT infrastructure encompassing compute, storage, network, and authorization authentication infrastructure, research objects, and services and tools. We know that the essential elements are helpful and they've been used in a number of research infrastructures and commons so far, including SURF, Reason, Biofair, and analytically, we're hoping that it actually demonstrates interoperability between commons by having something in these essential elements. using these particular phrasings, it gives a common language to how commons might structure themselves or describe their services, tools, intentions, governance structures, and so on. All right, so I've already introduced these, but just highlighting again that there are a consideration for the human or social aspects. Those are those top white hexagons. And then a consideration for the things that connect our human and technical pieces, ideally standards, technical pieces being the blue hexagons on the bottom. The GORC model in particular dove into each one of these essential elements and provided a set of considerations inside of them, determining categories and subcategories as well as characteristics of them, what we called attributes and features, in addition to key performance indicators and metrics that Commons may consider using to determine uptake, performance, etc. This was developed not out of thin air. We did a substantial literature analysis and environmental scan. We heard from 12 different speakers representing various commons that went into the creation of the model. It was then went through iterative stages and versions with our working group, through 5 plenary sessions, an in-person workshop, 35 meetings, more like 80 members now, and 6 dedicated task groups. So this was quite a chunk of work to make the model. The interoperability aspects that were considered include a host of things, from the European Open Science Cloud Interoperability Frameworks, both versions, the FAIR principles and all the related publications that come out of them, FAIR's FAIR in particular, and a lot of RDA outputs, including the FAIR data maturity model. So the model, however, is not prescriptive. It's in a spreadsheet container for now. It's organized by these essential elements with a host of information around them, with a glossary and metrics to help. There is also a report that goes through the narrative structure and our methodology around this with more information and background, and also gives us some areas of future work that we want to work on, but we also talked about that yesterday in our session, so I'll skip that part for now. More to come, but as you can tell by the fact that there's version numbers on everything, we're going to continue working on the model and improving it with more outputs that come out with further literature reviews and what we've heard from our adopters as well. So we'll move back to interoperability by the RDA FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group, and I'll give the mic back to Keith.
Okay, so that was the background of the 2 working groups, but why a working group and interest group? But why are we really here? So the question behind this was, as we've been working on the FAIR, the different aspects, the elements in FAIR, interoperability keeps on coming up as one of the most complex and one of the most difficult ones to tackle with. So we thought, let's bring together both the experiences we've learned in the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group, but also the experiences from the Global Open Research Commons interest group to see, well, what can we do around FAIR, and who are the players, and what are the best next steps to carry this eye forward? So, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the key thing that the FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group has delivered is the FAIR Data Maturity Model, possibly not surprisingly. If you dig into the different letters there's letters for findable, accessible, reusable, but also for interoperable. And I've focused here on what do we have as indicators for interoperable. I don't expect you to read all these. I think a few things to note here is we're following the FAIR data principles very precisely, as much as possible to the letter. And there we've often had to split out data and metadata because both are mentioned. So if you're starting to actually break it down, you need to separate those out. And as we went through the process with the community, we also asked, are these required indicators, or are they important indicators, or are they just useful indicators? It was this probably one of the most important parts of the discussion was to try and work out with the community what is feasible and what was feasible at that time, noting this was a few years ago. And there you found that in findable, accessible, and reusable, a lot of it was required. However, for interoperability, a lot of it only made it to important or useful. And that was because the community often struggled to actually reach these values and actually struggled to reach a high maturity against these indicators. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. What you do when you go into the model is you assess against each indicator what level of maturity do you have. Are you very at the early days, you're not even considering it yet, or have you completely fully implemented this? What you then get is this lovely overview. We've had about, well, we've been able to capture about 20 adoptions of the models and use of the models. We know there's more, but it's actually very hard to track all the different people that have used them and the adoptions of the model. But we've organized also a few sessions in which we've asked people to share their lessons learned from using it. I think one of the big things that came out of that is interoperability is hard, it's quite difficult, it works if there is a clear discipline community that has already agreed standards, has agreed approaches. In that case, it is manageable and feasible. However, it really depends on the research community and their maturity. If that is not as developed, it makes it a lot harder. And the questions in those cases, often the questions came up, well, who sets those standards? How do you get to those standards? And that's quite a process. Also, knowledge representation is quite a complex term. What does that look like? And especially, what does machine readable knowledge representation look like? That was really quite a challenge for some communities. It requires vocabularies, but who's going to then create those fair vocabularies and put them in a place that others can find them and reference those? So those were a number of the things we've learned from the communities. And finally, it talks about qualified references, but what actually do those qualified references look like? How do you capture them? What ontology or language do you use to build those references between the data set and other bits of information? So that's very quickly from the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, bit of background about what we've learned about interoperability through the years now. I'll hand over to Andrew, who's online, to speak about interoperability from the perspective of the GORC interest group. And Andrew, I can progress your slides.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I should also say we've had a question from Volmar in the chat asking if we can share the slide deck. So if there's a URL we can point people to, if you can let me know, and or you could just post it in the chat. Next slide, please. And maybe just advance through this particular build a little bit more. Okay, so thank you. As CJ has already identified, the GORC model explicitly recognized that there were multiple kinds of things that make up a commons. And I should say, before I get too far into this set of slides, that the interoperability concerns of the Fair Data Maturity Model are at one level, and we're now jumping up to a much higher level, not higher in the sense of more important, but higher in the sense of more abstract, perhaps. And so we recognized that there were multiple kinds of things that needed to be considered in the commons, and we've tried to color code those. So on the left are what you might think of as the technical elements within a commons, the services and the tools that are provided by the commons, the kinds of research objects that the commons deals with, the underpinning technical infrastructure, the compute, the storage, and the network. And those are, if you like, one set of kinds of elements where interoperability is a concern. And then over on the right, we have these very different kinds of elements to a commons: the governance structures, how you do sustainability, the human capacity, the people that are essential to make the commons work, how you participate in the commons, and how you engage with your users. And these are very different kinds of elements, and yet just as important. And so what we've been doing is thinking our way through what interoperability looks like in this more complex landscape. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, so here are some very, very early thoughts from us on interoperability. And my co-chairs may or may not be horrified by this diagram. They have not seen it yet because I did it in the last 24 hours. But it's an attempt to represent the underlying challenge that the GORC is trying to face. And as CJ mentioned in his introduction, the original impetus behind the GORC model was, how do you do interoperability between commons? So fair data maturity model is operating potentially at the level of interoperability within a commons, but also between commons as well. But the Gork model was really, how do you connect these two commons? And what that means is that we think that you need a set of pairwise connectors. And so this just represents some of them, because otherwise the diagram would be unreadable. So you have connections between two different kinds of research objects, perhaps, connections between two kinds of services and tools. You know, our commons can use services provided by your commons. Your commons can use your services to access our research objects. Those are relatively well understood, at least as a problem. Making it happen, of course, is more of a challenge, but at least the idea is well understood. But when you move to the top two curvy lines, what does it mean to assess interoperability between governance structures? How do you assess interoperability between our sustainability model and your sustainability model? And just to give you an example, if our sustainability model is we make all our services available for free, and your sustainability model is people get charged every time they click on something, what would interoperability between those two commons actually look like? And how would we define what that connector would look like? And Javier, who will be on the panel later on, has, I think, very usefully, talked about how we might make a distinction between hard connectors, not hard in the sense of difficult, but hard in the sense of more easily definable, which are the connectors between those blue objects, and soft connectors in the sense of harder to define perhaps, or less able to be pinned down in a specification, which are the connectors between the white objects. Next slide, please, Keith. So the technical ones are, I think, the easy ones. I'm putting air quotes around easy because I've worked on projects where we've done this, and it's not easy, but it's easier. The advantage is that we have existing solutions that can be drawn on and adapted. So connecting one set of services to another set of services is a known problem that people have been tackling for a while now. So we're not starting from scratch. The social connectors, the connectors between the white elements, are much less easy, I think. This is the idea of soft connectors that Javier has talked about. And there are many fewer existing solutions that can be drawn on and adapted. However, it's not zero. The set of solutions is not zero. And in fact, one of the examples is some work that RDA and CoData did back in 2015, led by Paul Ulier and Simon Hodson, which came up with a set of principles and guidelines for legal interoperability between two sets of research data. And that's work that hasn't been updated for a while, but it's at least a starting point. So I guess the position of the Gork is that we recognize we need to do interoperability. It's not yet clear how to define interoperability for some of these elements. And yet we recognize that for commons to commons interoperability, we're going to have to tackle some of those softer elements. And we have a submission in at present for a Lorentz workshop, which is being evaluated, where we hope to spend a concentrated week, hopefully in the first half of next year, if our submission's successful, working through some of these issues. I think that's my last slide, Keith. No, one more. So not all commons are at the same level. We're going to need a way of specifying connectors that are, if you like, backwards compatible. So as commons increase their capacity, the connectors still work. We worry about the connotations of the word maturity, but haven't come up with a better word. And the reason I'm focusing on maturity is that if we talk about maturity levels between commons, we don't want to be saying we have a mature commons, you have an immature commons, but we can't come up with a better word for that yet. We recognize the need for levels, but we're not quite sure what to call them. And one example of another piece of work that we might want to look at is some work that's being done by the International Data Space Association, who have this idea of connectors. Their connectors are not, if you like, at this very high abstract level yet, but they've defined policy classes for how different data spaces, in their terms, commons in our terms, might interact, where they have 21 different policy classes for controlling access. And that's another piece of existing work that we might want to look at. I think this is my last slide. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, I'd like to move on now to the panel discussion. CJ will be leading the panel discussion, but could our panelists please come up?
Great, thank you so much. And so introducing our panelists as they, okay, all right, it's an emergency. Okay. So online is joining us Javier Albacete from the European Commission, Gabriela Pino-Chacon from the University of Costa Rica, Danny Kincaid from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the USA, and Makiko Tanafuji from the National Institute of Informatics in Japan. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. It's great to have you. So this discussion is going to be focusing on these 4 questions, and we're hoping to hear from all of our panelists on questions that they have interest on. And depending on how time goes, we're very happy to open it up to the audience to ask more questions in the same area and to get more information. So the first question we have, given everything that's been presented today, and especially the mentions on interoperability from Keith and Andrew, from our 2 respective RDA perspectives, should interoperability be driven from the bottom up or the top down? And who might be interested in starting that particular discussion?
Now? Oh, great. CJ, how would you like us to just pass around? Okay, great. So should interoperability be driven bottom up or top down? I will kick us off with saying I think it should always be driven by the needs of the community. So if there are no use cases for why the need for interoperability is there, then I don't think you have the, if there's no use cases demonstrating the need, then you're risking the build it and they never come kind of scenario. And so I would say it probably requires a little bit of both. You need obviously governance and funding and things from top down, but I always would believe that it needs to be needs driven by the research community.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that have to have something of both, because you need to build those interoperabilities from the needs and the expertise of the people that are working with Commons, but the up in the decision the ones that take the decisions and all that, they have the view, the general view, the integrity view that can give a lot of insights on how to build that interoperability.
Javier, would you like to add something to this first question?
Yeah, sure. Well, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. First of all, hola o buenas tardes a los compañeros de Costa Rica. So my view, I completely agree with what has been said by Danny and Gabriela, that of course you need to, interoperability is a means to an end. You need to know why you need it or why is it needed at all. And that has to be driven by the research community, by the researchers. That is clear. However, I also think that to have it implemented in practice, it requires efforts in both directions. Because interoperability, as I think it comes clear from this panel, is quite a complex issue. You have all the technical problems, but you have the legal ones, you have the organizational ones, and that requires a lot of support. And the support normally comes from the governance, the funding bodies, and the policy making, that they need to put it high in the agenda, of course, provided that the researchers are asking for it. So you need to start with that, but then you need a lot of, to gain traction and to have it implemented, to make it possible, you need the top-down contribution, if you wish. So I think that the practical implementation, if to make it happen, it's somewhere in the middle. You need the two kind of efforts, and that is why it's difficult, because you have to assemble them in a way that it's efficient and practical, that can be put in practice.
Great, thank you, Javier. Mikiko, do you have anything that you'd like to add for that first one?
My response is for both, but in the long run, if I go back to what we have progressed at National Institute of Informatics to provide a data infrastructure for over 800 universities in Japan, first, you need to have bottom to down to get money, and also established the definition of interoperability for funders' point of view. Next stage is to work together with, I don't know which is bottom, but the researchers community, is because to produce use cases and evidence that infrastructure work and normally don't work. And so that we have to learn from the why not doesn't work. So constantly we have to bottom up, and then some of them has to go and then top down, like evaluation. So they motivate researchers. So constantly bottom up communication, but first bottom and then top and then down. So the simple answer is both.
I very much appreciate the complicated answer as well, however, so that I think everyone was coming in from the same perspective of you really need both top down and bottom up driven interoperability efforts. And I think everyone's sort of talked about the second question already in terms of who is involved in building the interoperability within Commons. So please feel free to build on your previous answer. We were talking about researchers and then funders from the top, but I imagine there's other groups you'd like to mention too. Who would like to start with this question?
Well, here there's a difficult answer because there's a lot of people. There's all the stakeholders that you work with. And normally when you speak with about interoperability, you talk of stakeholders that are kind of the same level technically, and they understand each other, they have create common vocabulary, things like that. But you have to think, especially I speak from a public university in a country like Costa Rica. What happened is that you have to think in interoperability with other stakeholders that are not exactly in the same technical level or interpretation level from data and all that. And well, what happened when you work with citizen science? Citizen science implied that people from the community will do science, and that means that will hopefully will do their own data and structure their own data. And what happened with industry, with some industry that is small industry that do not have the capacity to have people that work with data as a specialist. Well, how would you build up interoperability there? You have to go all the time because you are the expert to explain to people what to do? Or how can you build the capability in that people to be able to benefit from that interoperability, from the use of that data for their own benefit? when they are not expert and all that. I think that is one of the challenges of working interoperability between stakeholders and between commons too.
My answer to the question two is both researchers and the people like us who are involved in building interoperable infrastructures. And the researchers normally know what they want, but they don't care about commons, which is quite normal. And who care about commons is us. So we are quite prepared to read through those spreadsheets, like CJ introduced, because we believe that commons are one of essential connector between knowledge and use. So both roles will be working together, is my answer.
I think I might take a little side departure on this one. So I agree. I think that and I will preface, I'm kind of new to the commons concept, but I would say it takes maybe what Gabby started to talk about was the entire community. You need question two is interoperability within a commons. And I think it takes a village. What you're describing is a village. So feeding from question one, you definitely need the researchers involved to figure out what the interoperability needs are. You need to fund it. But then what Andrew said really resonated with me, that you need all these other invisible people, and the hard connectors, the technical ones, the easy ones. You need the folks who can build those hard connectors, but you also need folks who are adept at the soft side and pulling all these pieces together. I'm coming from oceanography as a discipline, and it's highly heterogeneous. And so interoperability within oceanography, it takes everyone to figure it out. They need physical data, they need biological data, and they need to understand it in the same scale and XYZ space. And that takes people across many different roles and hats. So who's involved in building the interoperability even within a commons? I would say it's the village. It's the village that will engage and interact with it, and everybody participates. I think, Gabby, you were starting to get into the interoperability across commons when you look at other needs outside of your own and figure out how you can make those connections to work efficiently and effectively. And I think maybe that takes us into 3, so I'm going to stop.
That's no problem. So before we move on to 3, Javier, who is involved in building the interoperability within commons in your perspective?
Yeah, well, my perspective is the one of someone working at the funder, at the policymaker. So I'm not active in research at this moment. And from that perspective, I fully agree with what has been said. The most complicated part from my experience is that reaching interoperability requires huge coordination efforts among a very varied set of stakeholders, from the end user, the researcher doing the work on the ground, to the middle level managerial managers running the infrastructures, to the governance, etc. So it's a bit, it doesn't go in any predefined order, because we were saying before that you need the use case first. Why do you need it? And then you get there. But maybe it's a bit of the chicken and an egg situation. Maybe to develop the end user, you need some support to fix it as an objective. And let me give you an example. Reaching interoperability for data in between disciplines, it is something that, well, traditionally, we don't have many examples of that. It's not the most frequent way of working. Many researchers work in their disciplines. They are in silos in a way. And therefore, maybe you need to set that as an objective to get a demonstrator. For instance, how to combine data from oceanographic research with other kind of, I don't know, Earth observation research for prevention of natural disasters, things like that. I'm making this up, but in some cases, so yeah, it's not clear what comes first. of course, you need you need the hen, but you also need the chicken, but you don't know exactly where to start, and that requires talking to a lot of people. And what I would like to stress is, from my perspective, of course, everyone is needed, but I think, and I am more and more convinced, that the role of the governance of the research infrastructures or policy making at the different level, however it is structured in different countries or domain, it is critical to because you need support, you need to define it as a goal, you need to create capacity in your community. Interoperability is not something that a group of researchers out of their own initiative are going to solve as a side job. You need to give them resources, you need to give them a mandate, you need to give them funding, and you need to support precisely these coordination efforts within your village. And talking also to other villages, but that is moving to the next question. So, and this goes back a little bit to the soft connectors that Andrew was mentioning before. You need to have it in your mission. Of course, you need the use case, and you cannot artificially make it a goal if no one wants it, if no one needs it, if it serves nothing. But that doesn't happen also spontaneously. So at some point you have to take a bet as a governance or as a policy maker or as an advisory board and strategically think that this is important to get there. And it's only when you do that you will start seeing use cases popping up, because they don't come up so naturally from the research community, because it takes a lot of effort. So you need funding, you need support, you need means, you need to create capacity. And this is a bit of a circular in a loop. All the elements are essential, everyone in the village, starting from the researcher, but it's a lot of coordination. And for these efforts to bear fruit, they need to be sustained, and it takes time. It's not easy. So that is why I think that having it high up in your agenda, in your mission, it's important. Otherwise, it's relatively easy to give up and say, well, it's too complicated, too many different kind of data, too many people. Let's just keep doing things the way we were doing them before, not thinking much about fair or other, and keep moving. So I think that the change that fair or fairness or interoperability proposes is really a substantial one, and it takes a lot of effort to make that a step change. Sorry if it took too long, my reply.
No problem whatsoever, Javier. And so to summarize a little bit from this question, it seemed everyone had a similar answer with different facets into it of everybody that's in the Commons or affiliated with it. And so where some of the responses were already looking at not just interoperability within the Commons infrastructure, which was obvious that we need both technical skill sets to make sure there's technical interoperability, but then also looking at these more social, human, or soft interoperability pieces as well. We're going to move into then who is involved with making interoperability happen between infrastructures or between commons. And Javier, where you were already getting into that, I'm going to switch it right back to you so you can keep talking.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that if you really want to be interoperable, is because, again, interoperability is a means to an end. And again, the end is being practicing open science, being more collaborative with others, no? Sharing your results, your data, your services, and using those of others. And that is why you need fair and you need interoperability. But again, that is a step change, because all of a sudden, if you really start doing that, and you are a manager of a given research infrastructure, for instance, or a commons, then you are serving a community that is broader than your natural community of users, because you may start having traffic from people, like Andrew was putting that example, I think, logging into your repository or your research platform from the outside. And then that can put in question, that requires resources, and that can put in question your sustainability. And the other way around for other commons, your users that naturally would go to you for data and resources, they may start looking around and trying to use services or logging into other commons. So this requires, to make all this sustainable, this requires a slightly different change in mindset and in practical organizational aspects on how to run, maintain, and sustain your commons. That requires talking to each other. In other words, to put it very simple, and talking only about sustainability at this point is how do we share the bill? If now we are doing these things in common, we are sharing things, we are in this together. How I'm talking again a bit too much from the funder's perspective, but I think this is important, and that is one of the main questions that comes up when you try to interconnect different infrastructures. Okay, fine. I'm willing to be open. We can sort out all the technical problems if we really think this is important, but how are we going to do it? And who is going to pay the bill? So again, all the governance and sustainability aspects are very important. Then on a more pragmatical aspect on how to deploy and standardize in a way all these technical solutions, I think that the players that serve more than one community, I'm thinking, for instance, of the example of what we call e-infrastructures in Europe, that these are infrastructures that provide different kind of services. Connectivity, for instance, it is here somewhere in the attendees or computing or other things, but that serve different communities, have a lot of potential or capacity to spread these kind of standards. So you also need actors that in practice permeate or serve different communities. Infrastructure can be one of them. And of course, fora like this one in Research Data Alliance or any kind of organizations that bring people together and have the capacity to reach consensus, A, and B, putting them in place are also very important, that they need to be fostered and sustained to get there. And again, I will stop here. Thank you. I could.
Thank you, Javier. What do we think in the room? Where would we like to take off with this particular question on who is involved in building the interoperability between commons?
Okay. Well, I'll try and start us off in the room here. And I think, again, I guess I come from a very use case driven approach. And so I would say you need to have the demonstrated scenarios of why interoperability would be needed. I think that's a really easy thing to achieve, especially in today's, landscape of sustainable development goals. I think that's going to require a lot of interdisciplinary science, solution science. And so I can see that there's definitely a future heavy need for interoperability between commons. I think to sort of build on what Javier said, it's going to require a lot of different stakeholders. I think that definitely the support, not just to build, but to build the capacity for researchers to understand the crossover between these commons. I think it's going to take more of the hard connections that Andrew was describing. I think that the mappings between these sort of data spaces are going to be critical. I think it will fall more heavily on the technical side of those components of the GORC. In listening to Andrew's explanation of it, I found that I wanted to say that as you put these two GORCs together in this interoperability activity and you started drawing those pairwise connections, to me, it seems as though there needs to be some sort of umbrella governance that can mitigate the sustainability and the differences in governance of each individual. And somebody needs to broker that or adjudicate that, and to expect that two will come together and seamlessly integrate seems like a tall ask. Although, building new infrastructure on top of one, and how does that scale and where does that stop, I think is, intriguing and challenging question in and of itself as well. But so I'll just leave it there. I think those were more questions than comments, but.
No, just a question there, because, well, yes, I agree with you, but that means a lot of resources. And that's why I think in that who is involved and even how the system looks like, you have to have all those administrators or policymakers and all that have to be involved and have to be convinced of the needs of that that interoperability, because if not, it's too much resources. In even the slides that you just show us, you can see the amount of resources that you will need to have a nice system, very efficient, and that can give us what we need for interoperability.
I agree to you both. And so in short, I would say people who are in the front gate for services has to be there. Because even systematically, architecturally interoperable, but doesn't mean that it will run between researchers. So who would be sitting on the front desk, I recommend to be involved.
Excellent, thank you. And so from this question, there was lots of questions that came out of it, which was interesting to say, well, how would that really work? But as evidenced by some of the previous responses as well, is you really need to consider the social human aspects, specifically governance and policymaking, as Javier pointed out, but then also, as Makiko ended off with, really honing in on, well, if it doesn't work technically, then that's it. So you really do need to be considering interoperability across different teams, different skill sets, and what exactly that looks like. That mapping is a huge piece of work that would be done even just between two identified infrastructures. So building off that idea of not just who is involved and the kind of interoperability that you would need between it, but then what might that system look like? And Danny, you kind of were getting into what might that system of interoperable commons look like. Would you like to start us off on that last question?
I can start us off. I don't know if I have the answer, but in my mind, when I see this system of interoperable commons, I just see a very large network map. And so you'll have these sort of node communities with these stable, loose connections, whether there's some sort of adjudication or brokering in between these. I don't know, but in my mind's eye, I vision this very interconnected web of nodes. But I think as we've all been talking through these questions, the sort of the policy and the governing of the larger you get, the more complex the governance structure will become. And I think that the technical pieces are the easy pieces. The social pieces are the challenging pieces. And whether you have a few nodes or several nodes, however that scales by the governance and the policy and the rules of engagement and the support. And I think that there may be models out there that have very close approximations to this. I think that, these sort of supportive membership models, and I think I'm kind of thinking loosely of maybe ORCID, where they have different tiers of how people engage with a system and how they contribute to that system and what benefits they get out of that system. And that sort of takes care of the maturity level for different nodes or different members of that system. I think that's where most of the challenge will lie.
To add to that, yes, you see, in Spanish, we don't have the concept of commons. For me, it's not only new, but it's kind of fuzzy. Well, commons a lot of things. And I think a system of interoperable commons have to be as flexible and as fuzzy as the concept is, because you have a lot of communities, the stakeholders that are involved in and how commons work, interoperate, and give service, and we benefit from them. It's a concept, it's a difficult concept to seize. And then I guess a system have to to get the same dynamic, because if not, you will have to be changing it constantly, and that is not operable, that is not good. But again, it's a kind of fuzzy concept for me.
Javier, do you have anything you'd like to add on a system of interoperable commons?
Yeah, well, actually, when Dani was explaining her vision of interoperable commons, I was nodding because this network is precisely the architecture that we are pursuing here in Europe to build what we call the European Open Science Cloud, which is nothing but the attempt to create interoperable commons across Europe. And the vision is that it's a network, or we call it a federation, but it's a non-hierarchical network connecting different infrastructures, data infrastructure, service providers, and so. And the glue are the shared policies. So that is why I was coming back to how difficult it is to agree on the governance aspects. I mean, how do we share things? Who has the rights? Who is responsible for what? Who is speaking the bill for that? And so. But okay, we are working on that. I think it's possible. So I think it's clear you need some shared policies and then also some shared technical standards. Those are the glue holding all these different nodes together. And that can be messy and can be complicated. It actually is a bit difficult. But again, I would like to go back when you asked the question of how do they look like, this set of interoperable commons. I think it's always good to remind or to think about how it should look like to the end user, to the researcher. And my vision, which is actually coincides with the vision laid out in the GORG case statement, is that for the end user, what he or she sees is something very simple. So he sees no barriers to access data, services, and knowledge, wherever they are. So that is the front end view of the end user, something very simple. So accessibility to data, knowledge, resources, and support. Of course, the back end of that can be complicated. It's what we are discussing here, all these permanent, the connectors, the standards, the policies, and everything. So thinking about this before the panel, it came to me the very silly metaphor, and you will apologize to me, but it's a bit like a fridge. You look at it from the front, it's very simple. It's white, glossy. It's very easy to open. You can think of it as a single sign-on, so login credentials. You open the fridge and you find absolutely you need for your survival as a researcher, right? Now, if you turn the fridge around, I guess all of you have done it at some point in your life, or moving or something, it can look quite ugly and complicated and full of cables and tubes and all sorts of things. And that is a bit what we are discussing. But again, I think the important, while we are trying to advance in all these directions, is to keep in mind how it should look like for the end user. And it should be really a place, very simple, single sign-on, and you go and get absolutely everything you need to keep advancing knowledge and doing your research. That is what we should never forget. Then again, the backend can be tricky. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you so much for the analogy of the fridge.
Sorry, it's it just came up. I wanted to share it with you.
Thank you. Makiko, do you have anything that you'd like to add for this question?
So I'll go short, Javier. So that a system of interoperable commons should look cool for end users, meaning intuitive and don't need to ask anyone. The architectural system of such interoperable commons are very complex because API-driven system, meaning API of other systems or API provided by service providers, and often different sort of concept and different sort of requirements. So a system architecture tend to be complicated and difficult to run sustainably. So I often wonder whether it's ecosystem. However, from end users' point of view, it certainly will be smart service.
Right, thank you so much. And so at this point, these are the planned questions we had for our panel, and I'd like to open it up to our audience if you have questions for anyone on the panel or the whole panel. We have a question in the back, Keith, already.
Hi, so I have a question for the whole panel. Just any thoughts on this? I'm curious how you all think about how we should prioritize the types of interoperability that would be most important. There's obviously nearly infinite ways when we talk about the hard and soft connections that these different commons could interact with each other. And we touched on a little bit in that in the answers about use cases and kind of the overall, the ends, but I'd love to hear from everybody more directly, just to dig deeper on how you decide what's the most important thing to build a connection between, because there's just so much you could do.
Would like to start off with that one.
Well, I can give it a try if you don't mind. It's a very good question because we all have this long-term vision, but as the person was asking, it's good to focus on prioritize and go one step at a time. Otherwise, you will not walk the walk. So I think I see two directions where it makes sense to prioritize to some extent. One is by within disciplines, so expanding a little bit the frontiers of a given disciplines. We have some good examples of that in Europe, for instance, in physics. So there are many communities that are very close to each other. They use similar resources. They look at different problems. But traditionally, they have developed their own methods, and they are actually neighbors. They are not that far from each other. So the efforts that they need to do to harmonize a little bit their practices and get more interoperable in the way they manage the data, in the way they annotate it, in the way they use some computing resources, and so it's not so difficult for them to converge on that. So we have been promoting that, and I think there's been very good examples. I put physics as one, but within life sciences, try to identify disciplines that are relatively close, that conceptually or the topics that they are studying are not so far. So this problem of how to annotate or how to define vocabularies are not incredibly complex, because it would be if you try to interoperate two very far away disciplines that use or deal with completely different subjects and tools. So that is one direction where you can start improving, and we have experienced or seen some positive progress in this direction. So expanding the boundaries of disciplines, or getting neighbors to talk to each other, put in another way. And then another possible directions that we have also explored with some positive results is trying to make services interoperable that are needed by different communities, but that have very different usage rates across time. Computing is one of them, for instance. There are computing available, not everyone is using it all the time, and not everyone needs to build a computer that is not using all the time when you can use the neighbor's one. So this kind of sharing of needed services that are costly, that are available, and that whose usage is not optimized at present. So a way of reaching that optimization, or reaching the benefits of economies of scale, if you want, is to make these services interoperable. So they are accessible by different communities, and it requires, again, standards and so on. There are some good examples of that, not only in Europe. I talk about Europe because it's where I have a more close experience, but I'm sure elsewhere. So these are two possible directions. I'm not saying that you have to prioritize, but if you have to take a step at a time, that can be a way to go, or we are trying to do things a little bit that way. Just sharing my experience.
Common needs and scalability.
Very short indeed. Thank you, Mikiko. Gabby or Danny, you have anything to add to this question?
I liked what Javier, basically what I heard was, the proximity of two communities or two ecosystems lends to that sort of low-hanging fruit connection, whether it's technical services or whether it's common research objectives and goals and norms like vocabulary use and things like that. And, I think that's something to consider. I'm always just a very use case driven person, and that sort of begs the question of where's the valuation process in somebody's science to sort of put that prioritization on it. So, I wouldn't go there, but I sort of always fall back on the use case scenario and where's the value in, something large that's devoted to a sustainable development goal, or achieving some societal benefit versus, I can't even presume to, I think it's a challenging question. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a question online from Andrew.
So it's actually, well, a comment and a question. So Volmar has made the point in the chat that what we need is the hard connections to build Javier's magical fridge. Danny was just talking about the need for use cases. Volmar's use case is that he wants to open the door and take a beer out of my fridge in Australia. To which my reply is yes, he's welcome to do that. He also then makes the point, of course, picking up on what Javier said, that we need those soft connections so that we can formalize the agreements about how we share the hard infrastructures, particularly the infrastructures that people charge for. And this is absolutely something that we're starting to think about in Australia from the perspective of how you build a national research data infrastructure. If the researcher generates a very large data set, who pays to store that and who pays to keep that around over time? If that researcher moves to a different university, can my university, I don't work for a university, I work for the Australian Research Data Commons, but can the university where the researcher started throw the data over the wall to the next university and say, okay, this is now your problem? The comment that I wanted to make, I really like the fridge analogy, but I also like Danny's comments about the need for, the phrase she used was, it takes a village, as in it takes a village to raise a child. Given that she works in the marine domain, I wonder whether a better analogy might be, it takes lots of skills to sail a ship. And that, you can't just rely on having one set of skills. You've got lots of different groups that need to be involved.
Are there any more questions from online or in the room at this time? Oh, question in the back there. Thanks, Keith. Those online, you might not see the whole room. The room is quite large. Takes a minute.
Thank you. This is a question for everybody. So, do you think that true interoperability is achievable in a world where data and systems and priorities are constantly evolving? Or should we shift our focus towards adaptability instead of strict interoperability?
Anyone like to start for this one? Oh, can we restate the question, please? Apparently it wasn't heard, and I didn't even hear it myself. I was hoping it was clear in the middle of the stage.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we are living in a world where everything changes, data, systems, everything. So shall we aim for strict interoperability or should we aim for adaptability instead? Did you hear?
Yeah, thank you so much. So just to reiterate, swift interoperability, so like a fast, quick solution for the things we know right now, or adaptability, so we're flexible and maybe leaning more towards future proofing, which is a word that's common in Canada for me in particular. Would anyone like to start with that?
I guess I would counter that a little bit and try and understand the definition of adaptability. From my perspective, if we're talking about adaptability from the end user, as we've been discussing here so far, I think it's a lot to ask to potentially have the burden of adaptability all the way down on the ground up to the researcher. I think that's probably not achievable. I think research happens in this really sort of the pedagogical kind of process that people learn how to do their research is slow to adapt, if that's what I'm understanding. And I think that the technological advancements that can facilitate interoperability are probably easier to uptake and evolve more rapidly than maybe research habits that would need to adapt. So I'm not really sure. I would tend to say that we may never achieve an interoperability that will serve every research need. But maybe that looks like an 80-20, success story, or maybe that is just something that will always sort of be the acceptable proportion of arriving at interoperability, but just throwing that out there.
I think I agree to you and appreciate your summary. And if I may add, I don't think interoperability itself is the necessary element of the success of research infrastructures. But as a result of once you build the interoperable system or whatever the system, you will know that there is an interoperability between something, which could be analytics cluster, or could be another database, or IoT. And what I'm appreciate to your question is because I myself wondering how can I or involve those people we just discussed to design interoperable system between AI, because in the research environment itself is already changing. So half human, half machines. So how between machine and human can be interoperable? So there are many interoperable requirements exist in the research infrastructure. Therefore, not just one or few commons, but also more broader concept of commons might be necessary to recognize.
Yes, and just to end that discussion, I think, yes, thank you for the question. I think adaptability really is something that have to be always there. Like if you take the FAIR principles, you will have to build up first accessibility or interoperability or all that that you need to be evolving in management of data and research. And adaptability have to be always there, because adaptability it partially gives you some of the sustainability that a system have to have, but you always have to be building the concept, the ability of the system to be accessed, to interoperate, and in all the ranges of the knowledge that you can see in that matter of the interoperability.
Great. And Javi, would you like to add anything?
Well, I was thinking that strict doesn't fit very well into what I have in mind, what we are trying to do. It's more the opposite, is flexibility. In the end, I mean, interoperability, like I said at the beginning, is a means to an end. It's something that allows you to be more collaborative in your research. So the real point for me is not to be strict, but to find a minimum common denominator with other communities where you can establish bridges and actually share things, knowledge, data, services. And then being flexible, because your mission, your objectives, and even your tools can change and will change constantly. So you cannot operate in a very strict environment. The point is, I think the objective would be that interoperability allows seamless sharing, something that is easy, like Mikiko was saying before, that it's very easy. Now, how to get there is probably something that you need to keep revisiting constantly, because new tools pop up, new methodologies, you have to revise your standards and so on and so forth. That is the back end of the fridge that I was talking before, that needs some constant update. But I don't think that strict is a good guiding principle for what I think we are trying to reach here. But okay, that's maybe I didn't understand the question very well, maybe.
Thank you for everyone for answering the questions. I think we'll maybe open it up if we have any more questions, one more from anyone in the room or online before we move on to the final pieces of this session. No questions? All right, so we get to keep on time, Keith, which is excellent. So thank you so much to our panelists. You're welcome to stay up here if you'd like. The next part of the discussion is going to be about how do our two groups work together, and I imagine you might have some ideas on that, but if the white lights are too intense, you're also free to sit off stage. So we'll wrap up with next steps, mostly in terms of, well, not that yet. We're getting there to the Brisbane part. About how the GORC interest group and its subsidiary working groups, as well as the Fair Data Maturity Model working group, can work together to answer some of these questions and also assist Commons and other research infrastructure working towards that interoperability. So we've had some great questions from the audience. We've heard a lot from our panel members. Where do we go from here? And this is open to both our panelists as well as to everyone online and everyone in the room. How do you see GORC and the Fair Data Maturity Model groups working together to help address some of these questions or other interoperability questions we haven't thought of yet? I have one idea, and I was going to pose it as a question as well. But the first thing that comes to mind to me is about all these groups that need to work together, both inside of Commons to make them interoperable internally, which is hard, and then also making systems of Commons or systems of research infrastructures which have to be interoperable between each other. And that's where we got into this idea of mapping and difficulties between governance and policies, as well as requiring the technical elements to be interoperable. But thinking more about the who, we've given kind of general names like funder, policymaker, commons builder, and researcher. And one thing I'm wondering, especially considering the GORC model helps to define a common language between these infrastructures, is would it be helpful to actually have names for these various groups? So we kind of have a general idea of what some of these mean, but would it be helpful to have a full list of the different types of stakeholders that are involved with internal commons interoperability and then interoperability between commons? And I'm kind of asking that to the room as well as to my panelists, even though I'm looking directly at them. So if anyone has any feedback on that, I'm interested to hear it.
Yeah, again, in short, I think it is very important to keep commons as a common language between models.
That would be my answer too. The common vocabulary between concepts so that you're all on the same page seems intuitive and like a first step. And there may be role vocabularies out there that are easily adoptable.
If I may add one more comment on this, by remembering all that path that we all come through this GOG idea from day one, we all already have so millions of conversations and discussions and etc. like CJ introduced. So it's in very important path for people who are coming from the back to or ahead of this research commons or research data alliance purpose. So even it might look complicated, or it may be discouraged appearance of models, but it is important for all people who are involved to read through it and pick up what you want or may need or might be useful to move forward. That would be a very excellent way for all of us heading to ecosystem to build. Otherwise, you will suffer from the same path exactly we already discussed. And we had a trouble, how do they simplify it? So I think it's really a good path to create the commons.
Great, thank you. And Javier, do you have anything that you'd like to add? And Gabby, how do we work together?
No, I agree very much with what Mikiko just said, and Danny also. I think that building this common language and being able to define and have a common understanding of the problems and the goals from very different perspectives. The people here around the table today, we saw at the beginning, we have policymakers, research managers, researchers. It's already a very important step. Now, if the concrete question is what should be the very concrete next step, I don't have the answer. I'm thinking about it.
That's okay. I think a lot of this is going to be our two groups working together and discussing over time on how we can really address the I in FAIR. And I do want to point out to Keith, like, do you have any ideas right away on how the two groups can work together?
I'm just trying to think, where am I going to stand? So I'm at least on some sort of video. Oh, there you go. Yes, it's an interesting question. I think what we heard today is the narrow perspectives of data interoperability versus much broader perspectives around the interoperability of commons, which are at a much higher level, and where those two align and fit. And I think there's a lot of similarities. I think we've seen that there's a lot of shared questions and shared challenges. I think there's quite a lot to unpick here. We've picked up the very high level, but we're drilling down into that and trying to find use cases of where interoperability has worked and where we can learn from those lessons might be a useful starting point, because I think it was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Danny that said use cases are great, gives you a starting point. And I think that I totally agree, makes it a bit more tangible and a bit more real. So.
Any other ideas or questions on how the two groups can work together, or about this larger idea of interoperability within infrastructures and then connecting outwards? I don't see anything in the room. There was one last thing I wanted to mention that I think is an excellent connector, and it's going back to Javier's fridge comment about what does it look like to researchers when you actually have things that are interoperable. They shouldn't really see it. They should see this glossy white exterior or maybe a different color exterior of this fridge. But on the inside, there's lots of stuff happening. And this very much ties back to how we were describing the GORC model originally, which was it's a list of possible ingredients to put into a salad. And that was also Javier's idea on describing it that way. So I think what we need is, when we look for analogies, go to Javier. He's got some really good ones. So now you can take the salad that is GORC and you put it in the fridge, and the researchers don't see it, but when you open the fridge, it's all there. So I just wanted to add that because it's too perfect and it fit in too well. So our next steps are going to be continuing to figure out how our groups work together, how we address interoperability, because it's very evident that both groups are working towards the same goal from different angles and different perspectives, but we really need both angles and perspectives, as evidenced by the conversation as well, in terms of needing both top-down and bottom-up, involving a wide array of skill sets, as well as people that are involved in these infrastructures and areas, and making sure that we're not leaving anybody out, but also addressing all the needs that there are. So lots of work to do, lots of conversations to be had. And thank you for those that are participating online and those in the room. And I'll hand it over to Keith to maybe talk about IDW 25.
Thank you, CJ. Yes, just in case you hadn't already seen it, next RDA plenary in person is going to be at International Data Week in Australia, we'd love to have you there, and we'd love to be able to progress those discussions, because these are discussions that are also taking place in Australia, and we'd love to have you in the room to have those conversations.